Airlines decide which aircraft to send on which route primarily based on demand. Large planes fly to busy destinations, while smaller ones go to less traffic cities. But demand alone doesn't tell the whole story, because a nearly endless list of factors determines the rest of these choices, and each airline has its own unique approach. Take United Airlines, for example. Its fleet includes 28 different aircraft variants, which on the surface sounds impressive, but in practice highlights inefficiency. You can see this by comparing United to low-cost carriers like Southwest or Ryanair, both of which have streamlined their fleets down to a single aircraft type. Southwest operates only Boeing 737s, while Ryanair relies exclusively on a single model as well. The advantage of this kind of fleet simplicity is huge. Maintenance is cheaper, training for pilots and crew is standardized, airport operations are more consistent, and overall costs are lower. United, however, faces the opposite challenge, because every additional aircraft variant in its fleet requires a new set of mechanics, additional pilot certifications, and separate parts supply chains, which drives up costs and adds layers of operational complexity. For that reason, United must find a way to justify each aircraft it operates, and nowhere is this justification more convoluted than with the regional jets, the smallest aircraft in its fleet. The makeup of these regionals is dictated not by efficiency or demand alone, but by a hard-fought labor agreement between United and the Airline Pilots Association, the union representing its pilots. Known as the Scope Clause, this section of their collective bargaining agreement limits how much flying United can outsource to regional carriers. In the US, the small regional jets painted in the liveries of United, Delta, or American aren't actually flown by those airlines but are operated on their behalf by independent companies like SkyWest, Envoy, and PSA. The unions oppose this outsourcing model because it's effectively a way for the big airlines to bypass the higher wages negotiated for their own mainline pilots, since regional pilots and crews are either non-union or represented by weaker unions, leading to dramatically lower pay scales. To make matters more complicated, the major carriers like United, Delta, and American retain leverage by being able to shift flying between regional partners if one becomes too expensive, which further suppresses labor costs. The result is stark. At SkyWest, a first-year captain flying United's CRJ-200S, CRJ-550S, CRJ-700S, or E-175S earns $141.40 per flight hour, while a first-year United mainline captain makes at least $342.75 for the same hour in the cockpit, nearly 2.5 times more. To protect their wages and bargaining power, the unions have placed strict limits on how much regional flying is allowed, and United's contract, which is structured similarly to those at Delta and American, lays out these restrictions in detail. For example, 37-seat turboprops are allowed in unlimited numbers, though United hasn't flown turboprops since 2018, and 50-seat jets can also be flown in unlimited numbers as long as their total does not exceed 90% of United's single-aisle mainline fleet size. In reality, this limit has never been an issue, because United's single-aisle fleet is so large that the regional 50-seaters don't come close to approaching the cap. But the most significant and binding part of the clause is the cap on 70 and 76-seat jets. United may operate a maximum of 255 aircraft in this category, of which no more than 153 can be 76-seaters. A glance at United's fleet shows they're right at that limit, with exactly 255 jets in the 70 to 76-seat category, forcing the airline into strange compromises. For instance, United operates two versions of the Embraer E-175, one configured with 76 seats and another with just 70. Physically, they're the same plane, but to stay within the union's restrictions, United had to create an artificially smaller version by removing a row and a half of economy seats. The space was then repurposed to give economy passengers an extra inch of legroom and add a rear luggage locker, changes that on the surface look like passenger perks but in reality exist only to comply with contractual obligations. This is a perfect example of how labor agreements shape fleet composition in ways that may seem irrational from a business efficiency perspective, but become necessary for airlines bound by these scope clauses. The end result is an artificially complex fleet, additional costs for the airline, and occasionally unintentional benefits for travelers, such as more legroom or extra storage. Yet this is only the beginning of the unusual fleet inefficiencies created by scope restrictions, and as we'll see in the next part, The consequences push United into even more unconventional solutions like commissioning an entirely new aircraft model to satisfy union rules while still trying to meet market demand. United Airlines' strangest and perhaps most fascinating response to the restrictions of the scope clause is the creation of the CRJ-550, a plane that doesn't exist anywhere else in the world and was born almost entirely out of a need to navigate union rules rather than market demand or engineering innovation. The Bombardier CRJ-700, on which the CRJ-550 is based, is designed to seat around 70 passengers, but because United was already at the maximum number of 70 to 76 seat jets allowed under the pilot contract, they needed a loophole. That loophole came in the form of taking a perfectly good CRJ-700, ripping out 20 seats, and recertifying it as a 50-seater, thus transforming it into the CRJ-550. The genius, or absurdity depending on your perspective, of this move is that the CRJ-550 technically falls into the unlimited category of 50-seat jets under the scope clause, even though it is physically larger and far more comfortable than the older CRJ-200s it replaced. What this means in practice is that United managed to expand its regional jet offering without violating the strict union cap, but the cost was flying a plane that was structurally designed for more passengers than it carries, making it less efficient per seat than comparable aircraft. To make the numbers work, United had to find ways to market the CRJ-550 not just as a compromise but as an actual premium experience, so they pitched it as the world's first regional jet with a true first-class cabin, extra legroom in economy, and large storage lockers for carry-on bags. This rebranding effort cleverly positioned the CRJ-550 as a desirable product for high-value business travelers in smaller markets, people who might otherwise be unwilling to take a cramped regional flight. By adding perks like 10 first-class seats, 20 extra legroom economy seats, and space for every passenger's rollaboard bag, United created a narrative that the CRJ-550 wasn't simply a downgraded CRJ-700, but a deliberate move toward offering a superior customer experience. Of course, beneath the marketing sheen, the reality is that the economics of the CRJ-550 are less favorable than other planes of similar size, because the cost of operating a 70-seat airframe with only 50 paying customers on board is inherently higher per seat. Fuel, crew salaries, landing fees, and maintenance costs don't shrink in proportion to the reduced number of seats, meaning United must rely on passengers paying a premium for comfort to make the math work. Still, the CRJ-550 reveals just how much airlines are willing to bend, stretch, and even re-engineer aircraft models in order to comply with legal and contractual constraints while still meeting their network needs. It also illustrates a broader truth about airline strategy. Decisions that appear irrational on paper often make perfect sense once you factor in the invisible pressures of unions, regulations, and competitive dynamics. The CRJ-550 allowed United to continue feeding passengers from smaller markets like Peoria, Arkansas, or Harrisburg, Pennsylvania into its major hubs such as Chicago and Newark without exceeding the union's regional jet cap, thereby maintaining connectivity and protecting market share in regions that Delta or American might otherwise dominate. At the same time, the uniqueness of the CRJ-550 gave United a small branding advantage. It could claim to be innovating in the regional jet market, even if the innovation was essentially a legal workaround. What's even more interesting is that United's creation of the CRJ-550 didn't happen in a vacuum. It was part of a broader competitive landscape where each major U.S. carrier has to dance around the same scope clause restrictions. Delta, for example, relies heavily on the Embraer 175, while American has also maxed out its 76-seat allotment, forcing them to keep older 50-seaters in service longer than they'd like. The whole system creates distortions. Airlines are stuck flying less efficient planes not because they want to, but because their hands are tied by contracts negotiated decades ago, when regional flying was a much smaller part of the industry. The irony is that these restrictions, which were originally designed to protect pilot jobs and wages, have inadvertently produced outcomes like the CRJ-550, planes that are objectively less efficient but necessary for airlines to function within the rules. From the passenger's perspective, though, the CRJ-550 is often seen as a win. Compared to the cramped and outdated CRJ-200, it feels almost luxurious. In fact, some frequent flyers have gone so far as to say they actively seek out flights on the CRJ-550 because the experience is that much better. But from United's perspective, the plane is both a blessing and a curse. It solves the legal problem of the scope clause while creating an ongoing financial burden in the form of higher operating costs. Yet, in the larger picture of fleet planning, this trade-off is worth it, because the alternative, ceding smaller markets to competitors, would cost the airline far more in lost revenue. The CRJ 550 is thus emblematic of the airline industry's constant balancing act between economics, labor politics, and customer experience. It also sets the stage for the broader discussion of how airlines choose which aircraft to deploy on which routes, because while the CRJ 550 represents an extreme example, similar kinds of compromises and trade-offs are baked into every fleet decision an airline makes. Whether it's deciding between a Boeing 737 MAX and an Airbus A320neo, or weighing the pros and cons of operating older widebodies like the 767 versus newer ones like the 787, the calculus is always shaped by a mix of market demand, operational efficiency, contractual obligations, and the competitive environment. The CRJ 550 may be a quirky solution, but it perfectly illustrates the principle that in aviation, what seems inefficient on the surface may actually be the most rational choice once all the constraints are understood. United's seemingly messy fleet strategy is actually a carefully designed system to balance business and leisure demand, legal limits, cargo economics, and global competition. Leisure travelers drive price-sensitive vacation routes that require dense, efficient planes like the 737 or A320, while business travelers support premium-heavy aircraft such as the CRJ 550 or A321XLR. Narrow bodies form the backbone of domestic flying, while a layered widebody fleet, 757s for long and thin routes, 767s for mid-size markets, 777s for high-demand trunk routes, and 787s for new or riskier long hauls, lets United tailor capacity with precision. Cargo adds another revenue stream, making widebodies critical not just for passengers, but also for global trade. Though maintaining so many aircraft types raises costs, it gives United flexibility unmatched by simpler carriers like Southwest, enabling it to serve everything from small regional towns to intercontinental hubs. In the end, United's fleet is less about efficiency and more about resilience, an adaptable strategy that secures its place across every market, even as demand and technology evolve.